Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. Today's topic, Problems in American Education, Part 1. Standards, are they worth it? So, this is the series that when I announced my return to the Daily Bolt that I was going to start, and I don't know how long it's going to last. I don't know how many parts it's going to be. I've got a lot to say, and I don't want these podcasts to get too long, so I have the suspicion it's going to break itself up into at least half a dozen, if not a dozen parts, maybe even more. Who knows? We'll see how it goes. So, much of the past year, I taught in the public schools. I taught middle school. I taught middle school science, specifically 7th and 8th grade science. And one of the reasons that I chose to do that was after doing some teaching at the college level, particularly undergraduate survey courses in geography, in physical science, in earth science, I found that a lot of the students really had an aversion to science. They were either afraid of it, or they thought there was no use for it, or they hated it. And that was a result of either experiences that they had when they took science classes, or the fact that they really hadn't had science for such a long time, and the environment that they live in, whether it's a home environment or you're talking about the neighborhood, the people they hang out with, they would give the impression that science wasn't really important. And that kind of shocked me because I remember what was now too many years ago, going through middle school, or at the time it was junior high, and then a senior high school. We had science pretty much every year, unless you were business track, and then you got to have other courses besides science a couple of the years. But you still had, if I remember correctly, at least 3 years of science classes, maybe 4. And you still had to perform at a high level to do well. It's so that your GPA would be good, that you could pass from one grade to another. And again, that was back in the days before there was all the notion of Common Core and 1,000 Points of Light and No Child Left Behind and all these other wonderfully sounding programs that often had great ideals but failed in terms of the implementation. And partly because the implementation was either too regulated by government or not regulated enough. And we're still in this situation with the government now, and with science education. So I spent, again, a good chunk of this past academic school year teaching at middle school science in Nevada, grades 7 and 8. The middle school was a 6, 7, 8 middle school. It used to just be 7 and 8, and then they moved the 6th graders in, as has been a trend both in the state of Nevada as well as nationwide. So ultimately, we have the potential for me as a practicing scientist, as someone with lots of scientific knowledge, to really have an impact. And that's why I went this way and went this route, took the job, because I thought quite seriously, okay, if I'm going to make an impact on how college students are thinking about science, you've got to go back quite a ways to do it. And many of the kids that I taught in Georgia had told me that they hadn't had any science since middle school, whether it was 8th grade or even as far back as 5th grade. And that's shocking in itself, and that's a story for another podcast. But I came back to middle school because I thought that's where I might be able to do the most good. Well, yes and no. I mean, there's lots of things about public education that I'll be commenting on as we go through this series of podcasts, but I'm going to focus today on standards. Now, nationally, there has been put together Lots of effort went into this, lots of comment from many, many educators at multiple levels of science education, other education experts, the National Science Foundation, various agencies that are responsible for science, other experts, etc., to come up with this notion called the Next Generation Science Standards, otherwise known as the NGSS. Now, the NGSS, if you go to take a look at it, it's quite a mouthful. It's not very simple in terms of standards. It's full of, unfortunately, what I will probably begin to refer to as education speak, where lots of things are in a terminology that really it befits people who are getting education degrees. It's very theoretically based. There is some practical basis to it as well, but there's a lot of language that ends up being very difficult to implement, let alone measure very well. There are some of the objectives are basically about process, about the students being able to think, to solve problems, to be able to apply their knowledge to solving the problems, and come up even with consensus solutions. That's all great. That sounds wonderful. But the problem is, how do you implement it in a school environment where the kids may not really want to play along? There's probably districts, including those in areas where science curricula get developed. We used the FOSS, Full Option Science System curriculum developed out of Berkeley. And there's probably schools in Berkeley that were field tested on it, and they know the curriculum, they understand how it works, it's been implemented very well, and the students' expectations are very well defined and set, and so it can work there. But such things don't always work and translate well everywhere else. Not saying that this is a bad science curriculum, it's actually not too bad in many ways. Although it so emphasizes process that sometimes it shortchanges on content. And I found myself supplementing with content based on my own experience and knowledge from time to time. So we come back to the next generation science standards. Most of them end up being relatively general, broad statements. There's not specifics such as Johnny has to be able to do X, Y, and Z from such and such material in such amount of time. Other types of standards for math and ELA are a little bit more based in practical metrics. So measuring the metrics for the NGSS can be difficult. And furthermore, they basically apply across all content areas. Whether you're talking about planetary science, electromagnetism, biology, ecosystem dynamics, weather and climate, earth history, all sorts of things that are in various science curriculums. The NGSS basically apply across the board pretty much to all of them. It's by grade level, and it's by basically the type of process or type of skill that they expect the students to have. So even this is all well and good, because some of the science curriculums that are used, including the FOSS curriculum, are structured to try and measure these as much as possible, even though it often expects things the kids aren't necessarily prepared to do or want to do. There's a lot of where the kids have to explain, and while this shouldn't be a task that is a big deal for middle school students, it wasn't when I was a junior high student, it's an amazingly big hurdle for them to cross, because it also ties into deficiencies in reading, writing, comprehension, and expression, all of which are also rampant within the public school system. So you've got the NGSS standards that are actually somewhat dependent on the kids being able to meet ELA standards, and there are woeful issues with that I saw in that middle school, and I know Nevada with its not stellar ranking in terms of K through 12 education, has problems with that, as do many schools in the country. So we have all that. Now, on top of this, if this isn't bad enough, the problem is that the NGSS don't really have a lot to do with whether or not students progress. So yes, you want them to meet a certain set of metrics for the standards, difficult as they sometimes can be to really get a good measurement of. Regardless, on top of that, the NGSS, though, is not used in any way, shape, or form in the state of Nevada and probably many states across the country in terms of determining whether a student is ready to progress from one grade level in science to the next. And instead, there are various other types of standardized tests, some of which employ some of the NGSS standards, some of which don't. But in Nevada, again, as well as in many other states, even those standardized tests for science don't have much teeth. The ELA and math tests have teeth. The education establishment in Nevada, as well as in much of the country, has gone head over heels, obsessing over ELA and math skills, and not saying that that shouldn't be occurring, but to the exclusion of all else. And so we end up with kids that might be able to read literature and fiction, and maybe even nonfiction once in a while, and get something out of it, and do some sort of math problems. Other subject areas, history and science, to name two, often get left in the backwater. And so even though we have next generation science standards, they're not doing a damn bit of good. And furthermore, as if, one more point, as if, I'm being gloomy enough. In terms of at least most Nevada middle schools, assuming that you have a 3-year 6, 7, 8 middle school, you only have to pass 3 out of 6 semesters of science to be able to pass to the next level. So you can fail half the semesters and still be good enough to pass and go on to the next grade level. The requirements are more stringent for ELA and math. You have to have more semesters passing at a decent level to be able to graduate to the next grade. Why is science left behind like this? It makes no sense. What I found in this middle school, and my colleagues backed me up, and I've heard this even from some others within the state of Nevada, and if it's here, it's probably in your state too, or in one that's close to you. So you have the kids that focus on their science in 6th and 7th grades, and they get 3 semesters of a reasonably good grade. And suddenly they have a year and a half of science that they can blow off. It's not that they don't have to take the class, they do. But they get to blow off the class, they can fail it, and it doesn't matter. So this is where policy is set up so that failing classes doesn't matter. It should matter. When did it stop mattering whether or not you pass a class? I mean, yes, there's grade inflation. It runs rampant. That's a whole other story and a whole other piece of my experience. But if we want to know why our kids are so bad in science and why we have young adults that don't understand science, including young adults that get themselves into Congress and think they know a hell of a lot more than they really do when half of what they know is bullshit, this is where the blame lies. You can't have such lax standards for getting kids from one grade to another. You just can't. And if we want to know why the U.S. education system keeps falling in standing among the world, 36th or 38th is what I remember most recently in terms of our ranking as a country. And still falling. Used to be number 1 when I was back in school. Or number 2 at least. Then this is where you look. Where has our education policy gone so far off track? I don't know totally the answers to that, but I have thoughts, and they'll be coming in more parts of this series of podcasts. I'm going to close this one out now because we're at 15 minutes and running on. That's long enough. So for the Daily Bolt, until next time, this is Dr. Jeff Tilley. Have a good night, afternoon, or morning, depending on when you're hearing this, and God bless.